Welcome back to the Select Committee on Victoria Planning Provision Amendments VC257, 267 and VC274. Before we get our next witnesses to introduce themselves, could I just advise that all evidence taken today is protected by parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act of 1975 and the provisions of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, the information you provide during the hearing is protected by law. You are protected against any action for what you say during this hearing, but if you go elsewhere and repeat the same things, those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Any deliberate false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You will be provided with a proof version of the transcript following the hearing. Transcripts will ultimately be made public and posted on the committee's website. For the Hansard record, can you please state your names and the organisations you are appearing on behalf of?
Brendan Coates, Housing and Economic Security Program Director at the Grattan Institute.
Thank you.
And Michael Fotheringham, Managing Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute.
Terrific. Thank you both for joining us on, I know what's been very short notice. We do appreciate it. We might just take some opening statements if we could. If you could sort of limit yourself to 5 to 10 minutes each, that would be terrific.
David, no worries. I'll keep mine fairly short and sweet because you've already heard from a lot of people today. Grattan Institute welcomes this inquiry into what are really important reforms. I think the reality we have in Victoria today is we have not built enough housing to meet the needs of a growing population. That's particularly true in places where people most want to live, so that's close to jobs, transport, schools and other amenities. We see land use planning rules as one of the key barriers to building more homes. So they've historically been highly prescriptive. They've particularly restricted the construction of townhouses and apartments in established areas where a lot of additional Australians or Victorians would prefer to live. About half of all residential land in Melbourne is zoned for 3 stories or less, and the politics of land use planning, so the decision making about what gets built where, does tend to favour those that often oppose change. The people who might not live in new housing were it to be built don't get a say, and the result is that Melbourne is one of the least dense cities of its size in the world. It results in a large area of missing middle prime inner city land.
A bit of order, please. A little bit of respect. Thank you.
Close to jobs and transport, where it's barely higher than 2 stories. And what our research shows is that a lot of Melburnians or Victorians would actually choose denser forms of housing if it was made available. This is not about saying where people have to live. It's about relaxing planning controls that allow then Victorians to choose where they want to live, to engage a builder or a developer to build new housing, and to be able to live where they'd prefer to. So what we see is that semi-detached dwellings, townhouses and apartments make up 32% of Melbourne's dwelling stock in 2021. That's increased from 27% in 2011, but it's still well short of the 52% that in our historical surveys have said that people would prefer. And it's certainly backed up by work from Infrastructure Victoria that says that about 20% of Melburnians would trade a house and land size to live in an established suburb in a medium density home. You can see that beyond those surveys just in the prices people are willing to pay to live in those areas closest to the centres of our major cities, where prices and rents for housing are higher than they are in the urban fringe. This does not mean that, of course, that people aren't going to continue to build new housing in the urban fringe. We need that too. People should have the choice to live where they would like to live. But these reforms, we think, have the potential to unlock hundreds of thousands of extra homes in the coming decades in areas with some of the best infrastructure, amenities and public spaces. I think as evidence of the potential success of these reforms, we would look at examples of upzoning abroad, like Auckland, that's been talked about earlier today, that led to a lot more housing in a very short space of time, most of which was 2 and 3 story townhouses and some 5 to 7 story apartments. So these changes don't dictate what housing must be built in Melbourne. They simply permit more housing where demand for housing is highest. And they have proved in opinion polls to be broadly popular with the community as a whole, even if they are not popular with some sections of the communities of some local council areas. So directly upzoning well-located land and better codifying what is allowed to be built are the most direct ways to expand the housing choices available to Melburnians. And so we think the Victorian government should stay the course on these reforms. We think the Parliament, they warrant the support of the Parliament. There are obviously improvements that could probably be made along the way, and we should look at those as the reforms are rolled out. But Victoria can afford no further delay in getting the housing we need built, because in a housing crisis, the worst form of housing is the house that never gets built. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would broadly support Brendan's comments, agree with pretty much everything he said. We are not keeping up with supply as we need to. We are living in Australian cities are generally some of the lowest density in the world, and therefore some of the most inefficient in the world in terms of the cost of living in them, because the amount of transport time, transport costs, pollution generated by that low density, by travelling around from one side of the city to the other, is incredibly inefficient. So we need to look at the way we're shaping our cities and live in greater density. That doesn't mean slapping up 50-storey apartment buildings next to quarter-acre blocks with a suburban home in it, but it does mean gentle increases in density. So the use of medium density or townhouses, smaller apartment blocks is a really important component. Local NIMBYism can always be a factor, but it's increasingly there's community recognition that we do need to change the way we're doing things. We do need to think about the shape and the size of our city and deal with a growing population in a more effective way. So the reforms that are under consideration by this committee are broadly very positive ones.
Okay. Thank you very much for your opening statements. That was blissfully succinct. My appreciation. We'll go into questions now, and I'll kick off. Brendan, you said that there was improvements that could be made along the way. And I think that let's just take it as given that everyone supports more housing. It's how do we get there that's the subject of debate, and also the adequacy and the efficacy of these amendments to deliver that outcome. In terms of improvements being made along the way, how do you envisage that those improvements might occur or be determined and then occur?
Well, I think the most important thing is that we roll out the reforms and we basically run the experiment. We see what housing starts to get built where, and then we could reform.
Bit of order, please.
Sorry?
Please continue.
Yes, thank you. I think we've waited long enough to get more housing built in Victoria. We saw in the case of Auckland that it wasn't until after the fact we saw how substantial those reforms actually were. And my biggest concern is that we nobble these reforms before they go ahead and we don't get more housing built where people most want to live. So, we have a series of processes for evaluating what's been built where. How much progress are we making towards the government's housing target of 800,000 homes over the next decade? I think that should be the lodestar of against which we evaluate our success here. Now, obviously, the planning system is not the only thing that affects how much housing gets built in the short term. I think we have clear evidence when we run experiments like Auckland that if we reform the planning controls, we get more housing. But there are other things that, we would like to see happen too. So if interest rates come down, we will see more housing being constructed. The Reserve Bank has been clear that every 1 percentage point increase in interest rates reduces housing approvals by 7% the following year. That is enough to explain, in large part, the gap between where housing should be and where we are today. So, our lodestar should be building that additional those homes to, if we would actually succeed and meet the Victorian government's target for 800,000 homes over a decade, we would see housing be substantially cheaper than otherwise.
Thank you. Mr. Fotheringham, did you want to add to that?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So taking all of that on board, recognising that there is, I think you use the experiment word, but recognising that there needs to be a process for presumably evaluation and improvement. And we've already seen, obviously, amendments to 267 since it was proclaimed. So obviously there are issues to be addressed. The Auditor General in 2009 and the Auditor General in 2017 recommended to the government that there should be in place a monitoring and implementation process. I'm not sure if you're aware of that recommendation. I'm wondering if you see that as an appropriate way of being able to actually track this process to be able to track this process and determine what are the opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, look, I think monitoring of this work, Brendan used the word experiment and it caused a degree of tension in the room, I noticed, but
it's all right. An apple strudel would cause excitement here at the moment, so keep going.
But
Please.
But it's an experiment
Continue.
either way. We're conducting an experiment at the moment where we're doing nothing.
Can we have a discussion around the Auditor General's, Ms. Crozier? Can we have a discussion around my question, and then we'll come to yours in a minute.
So monitoring the impact of these changes would be sensible, just as monitoring the impact of failing to make them is appropriate. We can see what happens when we fail to make those changes. We've been doing that for some time. We are not keeping up with need. We are seeing housing costs escalate atrociously and living costs escalate atrociously, transport costs, infrastructure not keeping up. We need to do things differently. That's very, very clear. So yes, we should monitor what the effect of these interventions are, but that is not a reason to not make them.
I don't think that's what's actually in dispute. The question I think I'm trying to get to is it appropriate that there is a mechanism in place to do that monitoring? And if so, is the proposal that's come now twice from the Auditor General an appropriate way to do that?
That's a good question. The approach that I'm not as familiar with that particular Auditor General recommendation, David, but the approach that I think has a great deal of potential is what New Zealand now requires, which is essentially requiring government to assess and councils to assess, do they have enough feasible capacity, and that's not just paper capacity, but capacity where you combine what the zoning envelope will allow you to build, combined with the fact of what it costs to actually build sufficient housing to meet 30 years of expected demand. That is now what is required in New Zealand of local councils.
That's a statutory requirement?
I'm not sure if it's a statutory requirement, but it's something that they've put forward under the current New Zealand government. And I think what's missing at the moment is an understanding of how far have we actually gone with these reforms. You know, we're having a conversation today, and you've had conversations in recent days about, particular parts of the reforms. We think that they will result in more housing being built, but the only way to really know that is to actually, to understand how big those changes are is to assess changes in feasible capacity. So we should have a stock of feasible capacity at any one time that can greatly exceed the demand for housing over that next period.
Terrific, thank you. Mr. Crozier, you were very keen to get in. Would you like to go next?
I'm delighted to. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And we did react to your word of experiment, because I don't think that's really not in the spirit of what the community expects. They don't expect this to be an experiment. They expect government to do it properly, and the consultation. But I just want to go to your submission, where you claim that Burundara Council has said that six-storey dwellings are not allowed. That's actually not correct. So your submission, by stating this, is not accurate. I'd also want to, and I'm just wondering why you would have. There is large buildings. So your submission is incorrect. But I want to go to the issue around the 800,000 homes, and you say that your Grattan Institute's calculations on this, and you made reference to those 800,000 homes. But we've just heard from the Property Council and others that ambitious target is not going to be met. So why do you think it can be met?
Well, I think it can be met.
How?
By building more homes, by relaxing the various constraints that are preventing more housing to be built. First and foremost of those is the planning system, but it's not the only one.
Do we have, so that's 800,000, so we're 17 months into this process when the government, over 18 months actually, into this process. So you're, in 8.5 years, you're suggesting that those full 800,000 homes will be built?
No, they could be built if we undertake the right
we've
reforms.
Heard evidence in this inquiry from a number of witnesses to say that one of the big issues is the taxes, and developers are not prepared to do this work because of the imposts, the barriers and the burdens applied by government. Do you believe that they are warranted concerns?
I'm not sure I would take the position of the development industry at face value that those taxes have quite the effect that they believe they have on housing development.
Really?
No.
Wow.
You think they have no effect?
No, I'm not saying they have no effect, but I'm saying that what we have is very clear evidence that when we upzone, we get more housing. I'm not aware of a similar study that says if we reduce the taxes on the development industry, we get that much extra housing, as we saw in Auckland.
So there's a number of witnesses who have said that developers, I think one, and I don't want to verbal them because I haven't got their exact quote, but basically they're leaving the state because it is, difficult here in Victoria to be doing this work because of the taxation burden. Now that's government policy, that's government decision. We're 18 months since they did their housing affordable statement, which is the 800,000 were a pie in the sky. This never could be met, given what the government is doing to the building industry. These things have to be built. They can't just pop up like mushrooms. They have to be built by developers and builders, and we don't have the resources to do that. And the taxation is adding to that burden.
So if we take as a benchmark the maximum amount of housing we saw built in Victoria in a given year, I think it was about 71,000, if I recall correctly. I think
A one-off.
The size of the construction workforce over the course of the next 10 years will be between 20 and probably 40% larger than what it was in the period in the late 2010s in which we built 70,000. Well, the workforce has already risen by 30% nationwide since the mid-2010s. So it's already grown.
Always in housing or in construction?
In construction overall.
But is
Okay,
it all
let's
going into housing?
let's let the witness finish their answer, please.
Thanks, Bev. I think, look, it's a valid question to make. At the moment, we are building a lot of additional infrastructure at once, but I think the perception that just because we've never built 800,000 homes, we could not build 800,000 homes a year. You would say that about looking back at Melbourne in the 1920s and say we couldn't possibly build 60,000 homes a year. And obviously, the economy is much larger, the construction workforce is much larger, the capacity to build is much larger as well.
What about resources, timber and the like? I mean, you pluck out these figures and you make these big claims, but there are a whole lot of implications along the way. So I think that there has to be some realism around what we're dealing with here, with these enormous figures that the government has promised Victorians that they'll do. 800,000 homes, which you're backing up. And given that the barriers that are there, it doesn't seem feasible.
So what exactly am I backing up?
Well, the government's 800,000. You put it in your submission. You've said the 800,000 homes to be built over that period of time.
So have I said that they will be built, or that if they were built, then this would be the impact?
Well, you can be picky with your words, but you're backing the government.
I'm sure it's a very different claim.
No.
Okay, I think we probably run the course.
No, Mr.
We've got some
Coates.
time. We'll come back to it.
Mr. Coates.
Mr. Berger, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for your
Just all
appearance this
bullshit. It
afternoon.
is.
Brendan, I'm interested in the survey that you mentioned. What some of the outcomes or the results of that survey were. So if you could perhaps...
Sorry, could you? I was a little bit distracted by some of the commentary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Brendan, I'm interested in the survey that you mentioned in your opening remarks, and in particular, what some of the questions that you asked and what were the audience the survey went to.
It was essentially a contingent valuation survey, so it's asking people to compare different options given reward prices and the trade-offs involved in different housing options. So between, say, an apartment or a freestanding home on the urban fringe, a townhouse in the middle suburb, and an apartment in a sort of inner city area. That's kind of the broad understanding or explanation of kind of how we went about this. So then within that, you're asking people, a series of, and I should say this work was done prior to my time at Grattan. What it was done was a series of essentially asking people, well, how much do you value this this particular aspect versus this aspect of a house, its location, its size, whatnot. And then from that, you're basically getting a sense of, well, given real world trade-offs that existed at the time, how much the difference does it make? How much more willing are people to choose, say, a denser form of housing that's closer in over, say, a freestanding home on the urban fringe? Now, since we did that survey, Infrastructure Victoria have done something very similar in 2020, which found that there was quite a few people that would be willing to trade a home on the urban fringe for something closer in. And you see that as well in the fact that the prices and rents for particularly, say, forms like townhouses, dual occupancies in sort of middle suburbs, they are very high. There is a gradient where people are willing to pay substantially more for housing to be closer to the city than they are to, say, be further out. Now, people can make their own choices. That's the whole point, is that government should not be dictating where people live. government should be making it possible for people to make those choices while also internalising the fact that it does cost a lot more to service a home on the urban fringe for government than it does to service that same home in an established area with infrastructure.
What do you think the survey would look like now, given that the urban sprawl is coming to its finality in some areas?
My guess is if you ran the same exercise today, you'd probably find more demand for housing in the inner city areas compared to back then, because those areas are now further out, as you say. They're not necessarily particularly well connected to infrastructure at the moment. And it's consistent with kind of what we see in Auckland and elsewhere, where if you got more housing built, if you upzone, you do tend to see a lot more of that urban infill occurring, which is basically the market at work, realising people's preferences, leading to more housing being built.
Yeah. Okay, that's probably what I've got for this minute. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Berger. Ms. Mansfield.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for appearing today. I'm interested in the question of affordability. We've heard different views on how these changes will impact on affordability. Some who say that this will naturally lead to increased supply, and increased market supply of housing will have some sort of filtering or trickle-down effect that will mean those on low and very low incomes will have access to more affordable housing. We're just wondering what your views on that might be.
I wouldn't get too excited that these changes will lead to cheaper housing directly. In the long run, yes, more supply does improve affordability. But this is a step in the right direction. It's not a complete supply solution. The demand is still very strong. We have very hot property markets across Greater Melbourne, and so it's not that demand will be fully sated by this, and there'll be no further need for competitive auctions because there's so much property available. But it does step us in the right direction, and it would have a more positive impact than not making these changes.
Sarah, if I could elaborate on that. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that building more homes, and you've heard it from others today, does lead to cheaper housing, including for those on low income earners. So the rents across the community tend to be lower than otherwise. The Auckland example, some of the biggest changes in rents are at the lower end of the market. But if we're thinking about affordability, we're thinking about two things. What's the cost of housing? And then what is people's incomes to be able to afford housing in the market? And I think it's pretty clear that if you reduce housing costs alone, there's certainly, even if you reduce them by 20-25%, which is, the kind of estimates that are out there, if we added 10% extra to the housing stock over, say, a decade, then you could reduce rents materially, like we saw in places like Auckland. Now, is that going to make housing affordable to everyone on the job seeker payment? The answer is clearly no, right? Like, they're still going to they'll be spending less than otherwise, but they'll still be spending a lot. And so it doesn't negate the need for other reforms. Now, our view is that the most effective way of helping most people is by raising rent assistance, which has already gone up. We've been pushing for a further increase. Social housing is necessary for people that are otherwise going to find it hard to find a private tenancy that need that extra support. But obviously that does come at a cost. Someone's got to pay. So these reforms to get more housing built, Dr. Mansfield, they don't take away from the fact that we need to do more to support low-income earners as well.
What about using the planning system to deliver some of that more affordable housing, say through inclusionary planning mechanisms?
Work's when done on a large scale. When done on a one council at a time level tends to be less effective, but if it was done across all of Greater Melbourne, would be much more effective. London has shown the effect of that over time. It's been a positive impact. It can be done.
Yep.
I think it's worth noting that housing affordability is not going to be fixed by one measure or even one set of measures. So while the measures that are under consideration today won't themselves solve housing unaffordability, they will contribute to and part of a wider strategy. So we need to be doing a whole lot of things, and look, inclusionary zoning could easily be in that mix.
Yep.
I would probably be slightly more wary about using the planning system to do this. Inclusionary zoning, it has a cost. So you are imposing what is essentially a tax on development. Some of that will be passed back to the landowner, who will get less money when they buy the land from the developer. But for other sites, it will make what is otherwise feasible housing infeasible. And the consequence of that is, yes, you will provide some support to those who benefit from those subsidised homes arising from the inclusionary zoning policy, but you will probably also raise rents for those that are not don't have access to those subsidised homes. And so that's the trade-off. Our view would be that there are better ways to do it rather than a relatively narrow tax on development. A broad-based increase in rent assistance is, in most instances, going to be a better policy than the inclusionary zoning mandate. Obviously, government's just going to have to pay for more social housing, and that's something that we would support. But it's not cheap. The average cost per dwelling per year for someone, say, a job seeker, it's probably north of $20,000 a year now.
Much of the criticism about these specific amendments has been levelled at VC267, which is the new res code, changes around townhouses. Some of the concerns we've heard is that they'll potentially take us backwards with respect to tree canopy coverage, vegetation, environmentally sustainable design standards, where we've got at least 27 councils around Victoria that have used to have a higher required standard than these changes introduce. So it's bringing those councils down a level. Just wondering what your thoughts are around some of those criticisms that we've heard about the res code changes.
Do you want me to take this
Yeah,
one?
you go first.
No worries. So I think the challenge here is that, regulations have trade-offs. If we're thinking about something like tree canopy, yes, you could see less tree canopy in some areas of the city where we allow more density, because some of those trees are currently in the backyards of homes that would be demolished and turned into townhouses. But is it better for the residents to move into those areas where they've got access to, a lot of amenity, a lot of parks, a lot of green space, a lot of tree cover, or to put them in Brimbank on the urban fringe? Now, people should be able to choose, but certainly say where I am in the inner city, I'm on a street that's got lovely trees, and at the moment there's a single dwelling overlay on those homes. You can't subdivide, even though we're within 400 metres of a couple of train stations, two schools.
Power line going down the centre of them as well, is there?
Thank you.
And so the result is that more people don't get to live in the area of Melbourne that I think is a great place and has access to great green space. So I think there are trade-offs there as well. Obviously, the more urban sprawl you have, then you potentially have, knocking out of green space and farmland and other environmental costs from moving further out. So if we allow more density, allow people to realise their preferences, to live, in some of the more affluent areas of our city where people most want to live, then that could reduce that other environmental costs. So I can't speak to the specifics of the 27 councils, but I would point out that there are trade-offs here, and that necessarily requiring a higher standard in some of those regulatory measures. If it means less housing gets built, then the alternative might be housing that has more environmental costs further out.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Davis.
Now, I've got a number of questions. I was naturally disturbed by the idea of an experiment. And I wonder, Mr. Coates, whether you're aware of the experiment that was tried in Melbourne in the late 60s and early 70s, where they allowed a let it rip go. Lots of beautiful established homes were knocked over. Lots of ugly 6-8 story numbers were built. And after about 6 or 8 or 10 years, people said, oh my God, this is destroying the character of our city. And they stopped it. So I'm just guess to say to you, we have an example in front of us, not that long ago, of where we removed these controls and allowed this type of development. Is that what you've got in mind with these proposals now?
What I've got in mind is what we see in places like Auckland, which is a lot of additional housing and cheaper homes. So
Auckland's actually a very expensive city worldwide, and lots of studies show that, in fact.
well, it's a very desirable place to live, in the same way as what Melbourne is. But we see that rents are lower than they in Auckland, and they're higher by 20%.
So you
across the
wouldn't
rest
want to
of New
repeat
Zealand.
what happened in the late 60s and 70s here, but we're going to rip out the protections and let it all go.
Well, I don't think we're ripping out all the protections. What we're doing is we're codifying what the urban form needs to look like. saying
Square
things
boxes, 6 stories, feels to me very much like 1970.
Well, I think what we're doing is allowing more housing, and we're making sure consumer preferences will partly determine what gets built.
What happens at the end of the experiment when it hasn't worked? Do you take responsibility at that point?
Excuse me.
When it hasn't worked well and we've got a shocking outcome?
I think my hope is that we'll be able to look back and see that we've got more affordable
You
housing
hope, you
that's
hope.
made the city a more inclusive city.
I just wondered if I could also ask you about the idea of packing more people in. The government has, parallel with this, announced targets for municipalities. So an area, I could pick a number of municipalities, but Boroondara, yeah, I'll pick that. I thought you'd like that. 70,000 dwellings now after 190 years of European settlement, and they want to add in the target 65,500 new dwellings in 25 or 30 years. Have you examined what would be required with some of these new densities to actually add in terms of health services, education, sewerage? Have you examined that?
Well, we do know from previous work from Infrastructure Victoria that it would be on average cheaper to build that infrastructure in those established areas.
Not on those numbers. I don't believe they've advertised. They've calculated for doubling in municipalities.
That's a good question. It's not one that I could speak to.
So can you actually answer what cost would be there in terms of each dwelling?
Well, I think what the evidence we have in front of us is that it's on average cheaper to build in those established areas than it is on the urban
I don't
fringe.
think that's right. I'd have to disagree with you on that. But
It's more expensive.
Sorry, where does it say that?
You talk about more expensive.
I just know I had one more question here. I do.
Sorry, I don't want to take away your time, David.
No, well, I'll come back to. I want to go to your point here. Reference 17 was the one I was looking at. The preferences were also reflected in work by Infrastructure Victoria, which found 20% of Melbournians would trade to live in land in an established suburb in a medium density home if it was available at a more comparable price. But they're not actually going to be available at a comparable price compared to the edge of the city, are they?
Well, at the moment, those homes in sort of the established suburbs are very expensive because that housing is really scarce.
And you think that the changing this will result in prices comparable to the outside of the city or the edge of the city, even though the base cost is many multiples of the land cost?
Well, I think
on the
what
edge of the
work
city.
from, say, Yimby Melbourne has shown is that, in areas like Boroondara and elsewhere, that zoning tax, that increase in the cost of, say, apartments and townhouses above and beyond what it would cost the market to build them, including a 20% return on capital for the developer, is upwards in some cases of $200,000 per home. So if we saw...
We're not going to see $200,000 homes, are we, though?
No, what we could see is homes
$1 million
15,
homes.
20, 25% cheaper than otherwise to rent.
So how much would the cost of a two-bedroom home be?
I can't
Would it
give you
be
an
$1
answer.
million in Hawthorn or $1 million in Brighton?
Well, what we see is the cheapest housing in any suburb is the denser form of housing that's been built. The most expensive housing is the freestanding home.
But that's
All
not
right, we'll just,
comparable
come
choice,
back
is
to
it? The
that.
comparable choice is actually the edge of the city in many cases. And in fact, you're not going to see prices under $1 million in any of those suburbs for a two-bedroom apartment, are you?
Sorry, I'd have to look at how much those homes are going for today.
Yeah.
Okay,
You
we're
don't
going
know, in other
we're going to
words.
keep moving. Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Fotheringham, Mr. Coates, there's been a couple of waves in our history. Mr. Davis sort of had a go at the 1970s and the sort of
You're a fan of them, mate.
the six-pack type apartment blocks. We also had the wave of in the 30s with the Art Deco apartments that were built, the walk-ups. Do you think it was a mistake for us to build those houses?
At the time, Art Deco apartments received very similar commentary from those who didn't want to see changes to their neighbourhoods, thought it was spoiling the neighbourhood. Now they're some of the most prized housing in Melbourne.
Why is that?
Because it was different. It was a change. It was not what we're used to, not how we've been doing things. It's much the same.
And how are they perceived now?
Much the same arguments as you can hear today from some corners, but change is challenging for some. It's delivered very good quality housing, good quality apartments, and as I say, they're often very much prized now and attract very high prices amongst those.
One of the other things we talked about earlier is, in particular in relation to the planning scheme amendments and the consequences of having more consistent, particularly in the townhouse code, having more consistent and certain application of built form rules, for example, that have greater certainty with deemed to comply provisions, the implication of that for replicability in builds. We heard that that has the potential to lead to an increase in labour productivity in the construction sector or other forms of productivity in the construction sector and downward pressure on price in terms of construction costs. Do you agree with that kind of analysis? Do you think that having housing that's built to more certain and common standards should decrease the pressure on upwards price?
It should decrease the cost of applying for approvals. It should decrease the time for approvals because there's much more certainty around what is and what is not acceptable. So there's a clearer set of guidelines, a clearer set of parameters that people can work to. Then yes, they can apply more effectively and more successfully, knowing very clearly what is acceptable. So yes, that will have a cost implication.
And you think that'll have a positive implication on costs that
and reducing costs
would reduce costs because of the scale and the form. Okay. The other one of the other things that we have heard is about is what's mentioned it previously in some of the other questions about the way that the current set of changes are dealing with things like access, the provisions that deal with access to things like solar in homes, the ability for protections in the new code for solar overlays and the like. Do you have any perspective on the importance of those sorts of provisions in the new planning scheme amendments as they're presented?
No, Ryan, it's not something we've looked at in any detail.
Okay. The other element that we've talked about is sort of a key theme in some of the discussions that we've had has been this proximity to transport centres, and certainly the approach in the activity centres is a significant core with a gradation out, as opposed to sort of, I suppose the implication of some of the scare campaigns that are out there that it's going to be, 20 stories in the suburbs in residential streets. Any perspective on the implications of, I don't want to say a scare campaign, misinformation that's being put out in the community about the implications of some of this work, what that does in terms of public discourse, and why it would be important for us to make sure that there's both consistency but also clarity in the schemes that are being presented?
I think we've been in a world, Ryan, where we've not allowed the demand that Victorians have for housing to be realised in the built form of our city. And so if we now relax some of those controls, we will see more housing in those areas. I think it's why it's important.
We will or we may?
I would expect that we will, because I think that's what the evidence shows us is most likely to happen. The question then becomes, where is it, right? And so I think one of the benefits of the reforms is there's obviously the activity centres, and I think that's captured more of the public imagination, because taller buildings are more prominent than, 3 townhouses going up next door to my place. But I would actually expect, like what we saw in Auckland, quite a lot of the additional housing will probably be demolishing one home and turning it into, say, 3, 4, 5 townhouses. So I suspect quite a lot of it will be that gentler density, particularly in a world where, it has become more expensive to build. It is more expensive to build, particularly apartments at the moment. And those townhouses and dual occupancies and small-scale apartment buildings are probably the sweet spot where you get the benefits of cheaper infrastructure because you're close to the city, because that's what the research shows. And you also probably maybe economise a bit on the housing costs. And we're seeing that in Sydney, where their low and mid-rise policy has already seen local residents in some of those communities affected band together and sell lots to developers to build more.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Carly. Mrs. MacArthur.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Coates, if everybody wants to live in the CBD, why haven't the 6,000 residences been taken up?
So just to clarify, are these residences that have been built but are currently left
They're
vacant?
there, ready to be occupied.
So
Clearly nobody wants to go there.
let me just break that down into a couple of bits, if that's okay. So the first one is, not everyone wants to live in the CBD. No one should.
I thought you said they wanted to live close to the CBD. Or in the CBD.
I think we'll let Mr. Coates have an opportunity.
Okay.
to-
So
Press on.
So people have different preferences where they'd like to live. You have the place that you prefer to live. I have the place I prefer to live. So does everyone in this room. What we see is, on average, there are people that would like to live closer and that can't because we make it hard to build those kind of homes.
Well, they're
Now,
already built. They're just not being taken up. What's your
those
excuse
particular
for that?
ones. Well, you're talking about frankly a small number of homes in the course of a city of 5
Well,
million people.
Still 6,000 residences that are not being utilised.
It reminds me a little bit of the conversation that was had recently about vacant homes and squatting. I don't know if people caught that story on ABC radio, ABC Melbourne.
And not to watch that program.
Radio show, where basically a home had been looked like it had been left vacant, and it turned out it's because the person who owned it was deceased estate was caring for their parent. So there's
think
often
there's a
lots
new-
of reasons.
Let's
for why
go
homes
to
are vacant.
the.
I'm not sure which 6,000 properties you're referring to, but there's a normal churn of properties in any market, and there's a sizable market for the CBD. So there'll be a range of property transfers, property disputes, property renovations, Airbnbs, and a range of other reasons that properties, newly built properties. So 6,000 in a city this size is a trivial number.
No, it's
But I think there's also a confusion in your question between living in the CBD, the central business district, and living in inner ring suburbs.
Okay, let's go to the
Not
suburbs
just urban
then.
fringe
We've got
versus central
a
business district.
situation in one council alone where the council have approved over, I think it's about 700 developments, which would equate to over 1,200, I think, residences. But not a spade is going into the ground because the costs of bringing that product to market are so great, nobody will be able to afford to buy them. That's because of the taxes, charges, various tapes, the cost of construction, etc. So they're not even a product that can go to market. So their planning hasn't prohibited the fact that these properties haven't gone to market. It's the cost that basically government imposes and the construction industry on getting these products to market. So, there's no way these properties are going to be built. How is it going to be any different with these amendments?
Well, your conclusion as to why those properties haven't been built, I'm not sure where that analysis comes from. Attributing
You
it
can
solely
ask
to
the
government red tape.
ask the developers. Ask them.
Yeah, and they'll also point to workforce shortages, and they'll also point to material costs and to a wide range of barriers,
absolutely.
not just government red tape as you're attributing.
And taxes, red tape, construction charges,
It's a small part
supplies.
of the reality.
The essential
What?
point is, though, that we're not going to necessarily see
Okay, I
against
think
council
Mrs.
leaders
Excuse
this
me.
week.
I'm not
excuse me,
sure
Mr. Davis.
who
I think Mrs.
the question's
MacArthur's
coming from.
got the question. So, Mr. MacArthur, if you'd like
Yeah,
to continue.
you also referred to rental properties. Now, Mr. Davis and I might have, were you on it? The stamp duty and property tax inquiry, where all of a sudden the government had introduced yet another tax on rental properties and vacant houses. It immediately resulted in a large number of landlords vacating that space, selling the property, taking their investment into state. So a reduction in rental properties was the end result of that government intervention into the market. Why would you be a landlord in Victoria? There's 125 regulations applying to you. So how is that How are these amendments going to improve the ability of people to be able to rent a house and a landlord prepared to invest in one?
Well, again, I'm not sure where that analysis comes from, that there was a vast exodus of landlords. That hasn't been seen
Go to the
in the
parliamentary
data.
inquiry.
That hasn't been seen in the data that I've looked at. But this is not a rental reform. This is a planning
Yeah,
reform.
but
It's about rental-
you're
it's about
talking
how
how
it's
it's going
applied.
to increase the capacity of rental housing as well. You referred to it
When did I refer to it?
in your presentation.
May I, Bev? Can I have a... oh,
Sure.
Mr. McArthur. So we should care a lot about making developments more feasible, right? We should care about that too. The New South Wales Productivity Commission did a study on this for the New South Wales government, just on less than a year ago. And the conclusions that they came to were streamline the planning system to make sure that it's simpler and it's more certain. That we need to boost our workforce, which is something I agree with, and Grattan's on the record in pushing for that. It was pretty careful about saying that sort of waiving taxes and charges was going to be the way to get more housing built.
No surprise.
Okay. All right, we'll leave
And
it.
I'll just leave it there. If I can.
Thank you so much. Ms. Watts, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm the last one on the list of questions, so I might go to particularly the submission, Mr. Coates, that you made, and I'm thinking particularly to page 5, where you speak to some of the challenges with councils and some arguments there about the zoning of sufficient land for further development. And also some of the problems that we're seeing with local governments restricting medium and high density developments to appease concerns of a vocal minority of local residents. I really wanted to go to the question I asked earlier about limited supply in some of these areas where we do have a higher number of appeals being made. Do you have any evidence or research thoughts around that particularly, because what we're seeing is uneven supply across Melbourne?
That's a good question. I think they'd probably respond to that in two ways. First of
Yeah,
all, the biggest constraint on what gets built is the rules that say what could get built. So,
Yeah.
the fact that where I live you can't subdivide. No one in my street has put in a development application to subdivide, as far as I can
Maybe
tell.
why they want to live there.
For a long period of time. The second part of it is then the application of processes about, given what is allowed, what are
Yeah.
the rules, then, what's the process through which a developer can sort of seek an application to build a dwelling or multiple dwellings. And certainly what we've seen in our work historically, so this is our 2018 report, Housing Affordability, Reimagining the Australian Dream, box 6, is that we see a higher share of development applications in, frankly, wealthier, more affluent councils, such as the Inner South in particular, going to VCAT and often being approved even though they had been rejected by the council originally. So we can see that in the numbers. YIMBY Melbourne has done work that I believe they'll be able to speak to tomorrow
Yes, we'll be asking tomorrow.
on a similar sort of analysis that's actually more recent than what we did.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Ours is over the period from, I think it finished in about 2015 to 2017. Theirs is over the last couple of years.
I mean, you did point out, though, that Victoria's planning system is more open to third-party reviews and therefore resulting in high proportion of planning decisions being appealed. Can I just get some understanding about that point that you made there in your submission on page 6, and therefore what challenges does that really present for Victoria as we try to increase supply and build more homes for more Victorians?
Well, my understanding is that
I mean, we're similarly sized.
yeah, the rights that Victorians have under the current, or at least the previous sort of planning arrangements, gave greater say to third-party appealers in the process than, say, you see in other places like Western Australia excuse third-party appeals altogether.
Yeah.
And YIMBY Melbourne, again, in their submission, talk through or present data on the number of appeals against DA decisions. that's, I think, come from some previous academic research.
Given the remarks there about a third of all local council assessing dwelling applications go to VCAT in Melbourne, Port Phillip and Yarra, are we actually seeing then confidence and supply be stymied in those areas where there is actually, in some local government areas, we're actually seeing a, population decline
Yes.
being represented in statistics? I mean, is that something that is concerning when it comes to
I think it's
the
concerning.
challenge of more homes in middle ring suburbs and Melbourne?
It's certainly concerning for me in a world where we know that more people would like to live in those areas.
Yes.
This again is not the planning system deciding where people must live. It's presenting opportunities for market forces to build more housing. Because it's only if people want to live in those areas that more housing is going to get built. If everyone wanted to go to the greenfields, then we would just see further greenfield development and no subdivisions. But the reality is that people have a different mix of preferences. And
But there is an unmet high demand for
Absolutely.
housing in
Absolutely.
these suburbs.
Yes.
Is that
I think that's
what
very
your
clear.
evidence is showing? Is that,
Yeah.
Doctor?
Yeah, no,
Is that,
clear-
is that what
clear-
you're hearing as
yeah,
well?
yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay. I'm kind of interested to explore that further about the equity of the supply and where it's going and the economic circumstances of those particular LGAs, because I'm thinking about my community in the Northern Metropolitan Region and the numbers of applications going to VCAT across the urban fringe versus the middle ring suburbs, and there is that real inequality there, and that's why VC267, I think, will be so much supported in areas of our middle ring suburbs. That's it for my questions, but I appreciate the opportunity, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Watts. We've got a few minutes left if you're good to keep going with us. Mr Davis, a quick question.
Large tracts of land that are available for rezoning and for potential development in the inner city, like Fisherman's Bend. Why have they not been brought on, and why have you not talked about those as an option to bring forward?
Well, there is development occurring in Fisherman's Bend.
Compared to its capacity.
Sorry?
Very little compared to its capacity.
It's sitting there for years. It's the government's inaction. Nothing.
I'm just saying, why have you not
I think
brought
the
that
question's
forward?
been asked.
Yeah.
Would you like to respond or not? Whichever you prefer.
No, that's a great question. On the very particulars, Mr Davis, of Fisherman's Bend, as to why that particular area at this particular time has not seen the development, that's not something that I'm across in detail.
The principle more generally, perhaps, of matters of large tracts of this type that are available for development and rezoning with appropriate infrastructure.
Like a great example of that is, the Yarra Bend precinct in Fairfield, Alphington, right? We've seen upzoning, or basically we've demolished the former site. We've built a lot of housing.
Paper factory.
The paper factory, sorry. That's resulted in a lot of additional rental properties in that area. I had to look for a short-term rental for a family member recently, and that was the only place pretty much in the entire suburb where you could find somewhere to rent. So, I think the specifics of, why Fisherman's Bend hasn't been developed, that's a great question. We're happy to look at it. But generally what I'd want to look at is what are the prices and rents for those developments? What's the infrastructure going into those areas? Has it been upzoned before the infrastructure was there? That's some of the questions you'd want to ask.
So
right?
I would put it to you that there are options, rather than destroying established suburbs, there are actually options of areas that have had previous industrial areas that could be brought forward. You're not opposed to that idea, it seems, in principle, but you'd want to look at the detail.
Certainly, I
Fair
think
enough.
the principle would be that you want people to be able to live, Victorians to congregate in the areas where they most want to. You mentioned the word destroy. I would push back somewhat and say cities with similar populations but high densities, places like Vancouver, Toronto and Vienna, outrank Melbourne on quality of life measures. So, I don't think necessarily you seem to be equating more density equals destruction.
It is.
Well, there will be destruction under these planning amendments. That's what will happen.
It will involve
It will
change.
tear down
No,
large
it'll-
parts
it'll
of established
change
Melbourne.
communities and amenity.
and heritage. So
Much like the
that's-
Architect Department.
when there are options, I'm putting to you that there are
Dr.
options. That's my
Fotheringham, would
point.
you like to make a contribution on this question?
Change is scary, as we've said.
It's not about change, it's about outright destruction.
Lesson of the peacemakers. Mr. Batchelor,
What,
would you have
what I
another
was
bit?
going
Oh,
to say,
sorry, go
though,
ahead.
what I was going to say when Georgie's finished, is that a diversity of solutions is what's needed. That is not Fisherman's Bend will solve all of it will not solve all of Melbourne's
Scrooge.
problems. Nor will these provisions, nor will greenfield development on the outer urban fringes. There's no one solution to these things. We need to be doing multiple things and not cutting off one because, there's another thing we could be doing instead that's more convenient to a particular group.
Thank you. Mr. Batchelor.
Because we're faced with choices, right? This government, parliaments, members of the Legislative Council, indeed, face choices about whether we support further action or we oppose further action. So I'm interested in the consequences you think of us not pursuing an agenda to provide more housing for people who want it, what the consequences of that might be for our community.
Worsening housing unaffordability. We see in some international cities in parts of Europe and parts of Asia, people aren't sharing houses, they're sharing bedrooms because the housing shortage is getting to that stage. There's a risk that we end up following that path and dramatically undersupplying housing to the point that the options people have to take are severely compromised and severely overcrowded, what is in Australian terms defined as homelessness.
Brendan?
I'd say we end up with a poorer economy. I think that's been shown by work from Infrastructure Victoria and a large body of evidence from urban economics. It would result in more expensive housing, as Michael has mentioned. A greater gap between rich and poor in our suburbs across our cities. But also our cities are giant labour markets. They are the ways in which the reason cities exist is because they're a way for economies to thrive and people to access more jobs and businesses to access more supplies. And certainly if we have a world where we allow more housing to be built, we end up with a denser city. If that's what people want, that's what will happen. If that's not what people want, then it won't happen. But we should make sure we ask the residents that would move into the area as well as those that live there already. And so we want to see, I think the consequence is we will have worse affordability, poor environmental outcomes and poorer Victorians.
Instead, you'll roll over.
And on
the
that note,
Democratic
we might
approach.
call it a wrap. So, thank you. Could I firstly thank you, Dr. Fotheringham, Mr. Coates. It's greatly appreciated you coming in today. Appreciate your very thoughtful contributions and the robust discussion of which you've had an
Thank you very
opportunity to participate in. I just note that a copy of the transcript will be provided to you for review before it's published to the website. The committee will now take a break for 5 minutes to reset, and we will be joined by Dr. Jonathan Spear from Infrastructure Victoria for our final session of the day. Thank you.